And with that, good afternoon and welcome everyone to what will be an enlightening and fun discussion on the best of data visualization, both home and abroad. I am your facilitator for today's session, Siyabonga Africa, the Program Officer for the South Africa Media Innovation Program. And this discussion is brought to you by the wonderful people running the Africa Investigative Journalism Conference 16 COVID edition. Our main events will feature presentations and discussions on data visualizations from Global Investigative Journalism Network IT Coordinator and Media Hack Collective co-founder Alistair Otter, Open Up SA Director Adi Ayul, and freelance data journalist and trainer Raymond Joseph. So before we kick things off, I just wanted to say a few words. Data visualization has evolved from its humble beginnings with John Snow's geospatial tracing of a cholera outbreak in 19th century England to groundbreaking visualizations of the state of the world by publications as large as the New York Times and as small as a two-person team here in South Africa. What they all have in common is the end goal of helping us to understand information about our world just a little bit better. So before I dig into our speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. We want to make this an engaging and interactive experience, and our speakers will leave room for questions both during and after their presentations. If you have a pressing question, you can raise your hand at the bottom of your screen, and we will see if we can get to it if there is time. Otherwise, please put any of your questions. Please put your questions in the comments section of this call, and I'll queue them. I'll line them up for our speakers. We'll get to them at the end of their sessions. And with that out of the way, I will now hand it over to our first speaker, Alistair Otter, who will be chatting to us about the best of data visualization, or yes, the best of data journalism, rather, around the world. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sia, and welcome everyone. Glad to be part of this session today. Just going to try and share a screen quickly. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit here. Because I think it's very hard to represent data journalism, data visualization. It's a whole lot of static images. So I'm going to be, just want to get up the presentation, then we'll get going. Yes, so as Sia said, I'm from the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and I also represent a local South African data visualization operation called Media Hack Collective. At the GIJN, I'm the IT coordinator and assist with a lot of kind of general purpose work with them. What we're looking at today, the intention of today was to look at kind of data journalism / data visualization from around the world over roughly the last kind of year or so. I stray a little bit out of that to incorporate one or two things that happened a little bit further back than that, but I think that are worth mentioning. This job, and I've done this a couple of times, this presentation a couple of times in the past, this gets harder and harder every single year. A few years ago, it was relatively easy to find five or six, am I maybe showing this, am I showing the right screen? I hope so. Yes. Anyway, so a couple of years ago, it was relatively easy to kind of find good examples of data journalism, data visualization, but the field has expanded enormously over the last couple of years. And particularly as new tools become available, new techniques become available, and people are starting to push the boundaries of what is possible, particularly online. But I don't want to only focus on online. We're seeing a broad range of newsrooms starting to produce it. From one of the original kind of ones that made an impact was the Snowfall piece by the New York Times. The New York Times continues to make some of the more impressive data visualization and data journalism stories today, but they're by no means the only ones. And as Sia said, even small teams are doing this sort of thing. So really, we're going to look at kind of, and I've got like 20 minutes or so. So this is not an exhaustive list of stories by any means, but I'll give you a couple of pointers to other sources. I mean, I think we just upfront need to say that there's a range of topics covered within this. One is data journalism, i.e. using data to find a story and tell that story. Sometimes it's visual. It doesn't have to be visual. There's data visualization, which is very much kind of visualizes the actual data within a story in some kind of compelling way. There's also data as a source, using that data to write that story, or data as a product, so creating interactive kind of tools or visualizations that people can explore the data with. I delve a little bit further back than a year in one or two cases, but in generally speaking, a lot of what we've seen in the last 12 months has obviously been dominated by COVID-19 coverage around the world. So there is a fair amount of items that I want to pick on there. And then there's a couple of other pieces that I think that are well worth looking at. Before I go any further, as I said, this is not by no means exhaustive. So there are a number of other places I'd recommend you look at to get an idea of what else other people work that other people are doing is. One of those is the Sigma Awards. The 2020 Sigma Awards happened at the beginning of this year. I think it was January or February. It took over from the GEN Data Journalism Awards. It's an international one, and the best of the best take part in that. I was a judge on those awards. Those are well worth having a look at. I'll pick out one or two of those in this, but I'm not heavily focused on those. And then at GIJN, we have a data journalism top 10 every single Thursday. We publish links to both data journalism stories, as well as data journalism related or data visualization related topics that are kind of trending and popular and current. So I'd encourage you to look at that every Thursday. We publish that every Thursday morning, South African time. And then for one other, there's a publication called the Nightingale by the Data Visualization Society, which is the Data Visualization Society is a relatively new organization and kind of promotes the work of data visualization and data journalism. Well worth checking out to see what they're doing. I'm going to dive into this, and I'm going to have to kind of jump around a little bit. I think you'll see that in the pieces that I've picked that I'm picking on aren't necessarily the absolute best in the world, but I think that they represent something that is worth kind of taking into consideration. So, and we'll also see that there's a couple of key organizations that I think are doing some of the better work at the moment in this kind of space. One of these is Reuters. Reuters is doing their graphics team. They've invested in a huge amount in kind of their data team and their visualization team, and they're doing some fantastic work in this kind of space. In this particular one, and like I'm saying, I'm going to switch between things so that we can kind of get an idea of what it is. It's a fairly simple premise. They took the idea of 5,400 people are dying each day as a result of COVID. And how much, what does that look like? So what they did is very simple. I like the simplicity of something like this. But as you start scrolling, the clock starts counting. 1 hour, 370 something deaths, 2 hours, 500, and so on. You can continue to go through this. It's a nice, neat visualization of this. I'm going to scroll through this very quickly so we can go right down. And then it moves into a more detailed kind of breakdown of the different areas in the world and the death tolls in that. I think this is a very simple one to start off with, and I like it mostly because it takes a very big number and turns it into a very simple thing to understand in a very basic kind of way, and then gives you some context further on. The next one, what I'm going to look at next is we're going to look at a number of bigger operations. I think the Financial Times has been doing some fantastic stuff, and I think that there's a number of elements within this that I think are well worth looking at.
So may I?
I'm seeing something in the background.
So may I?
Anyway, so the Financial Times does some particularly excellent work around data visualization and data journalism, data storytelling. One of the things that I think that stands out for me is in a world where kind of a lot of people are moving towards kind of very interactive elements and interactive things. Sometimes, I think Raymond mentioned the word the other day, a little bit like data porn. I think sometimes the interactive elements can be excellent, but they can also be overdone. Sometimes they don't lend as much value as you need. I think this kind of use by the Financial Times of static graphics, but are very well thought through, great colors used, telling a story in a very simple graphic. And I think that this is something that we need to start, particularly as data journalists working, is like, we're not just trying to put data on a screen, we're actually trying to put data on a screen and visualize and explain in the simplest possible way, what does this data actually mean? And I think one of the components of the work done by the Financial Times particularly is their kind of direct labeling of things, meaning that I can look at a static image, I don't actually have to interact with it in order to get some meaning out of it. So similar kinds of things. And we'll see, I think The Economist does a lot of this as well, and I've got a few other examples. People's kind of falling back a little bit towards static visualizations of data, making them very simple and quick to understand. But having said that, there are some excellent interactive versions. But before we do one of those, I think we also have to look at the issue of resources. There's a number of issues around. A lot of the work that I'll show here is done by like Financial Times, New York Times, etc. And these are large newsrooms. And sometimes if you look at the credits just alone, for one article alone, it can list like 15, 20 people. Clearly not everyone has those kinds of resources. And yet many of them are producing excellent work. And I think one of the ones that I want to highlight, not for any one particular piece, but is Kenya's NEWSPLEX operation, which is doing some awesome work around kind of telling stories in an understandable way, doing in most cases an excellent graphical representation of these stories. I mean, I like the approach of this. There's a related story which actually delves into a lot of the data behind this that goes with it. And you can actually go to the NEWSPLEX website and they show all the work that they've done. But this is a very nice, simple graphics that are compelling, easy to understand, and kind of fit both the message and the medium kind of combine in a nice way. I think the NEWSPLEX has been doing some excellent work for the last couple of years now. And I've included them for the last 2 years at least. I'm conscious of time, so I'm moving on quite quickly. On the other hand, we have the New York Times, which is, I don't know how many people worked on this particular one, but this is a fantastic piece. Clearly, they had a lot of resources that went into this kind of operation. I don't know if you've seen this one. I just want to, how do I get that out of the way? Yeah. I want to illustrate this because what they did, and we actually in South Africa tried to replicate this to some other degree in a similar kind of story that we did with one of our partners. But this was kind of the piece that inspired us in many ways. Is it tells the story of how COVID-19, coronavirus, kind of landed in the US, and then how it's spread. And they use a number of different techniques. I mean, this is a very interactive, not interactive per se, but it's an engaging kind of telling piece. I'm skipping too fast here. So it starts, brings in the storytelling and the data all in one piece. So the first two known cases were in Seattle and Chicago. Shortly after that, in February, there were 15 known coronavirus cases. And as you scroll through this, it starts telling the story of how COVID-19 entered the US. How it started to spread with in the various main centers in the US. But one of the things that I kind of really like about this piece. So first off, it delves into, so where did it come from? So it says, you can see the incoming kind of, they track the incoming cases from Europe, the rest of the world, from Asia, etc. And then they used, and most of us don't have the resources to do something like this, but if you do, it's a fantastic idea, is they used mobile data to actually map how people moved around the country and how that helped aid the spread of, yeah, there we go. Cell phone data, they used this to kind of map the data across the spread of COVID-19 across the US. It's a very long piece as well, worth your time. All of these are linked in the presentation, so I'd encourage you to look at them in your own time, but well worth having a look at something like that. Okay, and then I just want to see what we're going to do next. And then I think, something else that I like is kind of simple storytelling, but that really delves into the issues that people had around this. And in this particular case, this is by Alpi, and it was published. It was about, so during late late March, I think it was March the 23rd to April the 3rd or something, there were roughly 2,000 hospitalizations in Spain a day. This is translated by Google Translate, so the text may read a bit funny from Spanish to English, but they documented this kind of like 2-week period in which they had on average 2,000 hospitalizations a day, at times peaking at 3,500 hospitalizations a day, and told in a very simple kind of story. You know, like sometimes it doesn't have to be the flashiest kind of work in the world, but just kind of getting the basics and information across. So they use very simple kind of graphics. They also have a lot of ads, unfortunately, but there we go. We have to pay the bills. Kind of breaking down the regions and where these hospitalizations were happening. So, I mean, it goes from, you know, New York Times with an incredible presentation of kind of how the virus spread, to narrowing in on kind of data around just a short 2-week period in Spain, and how the whole entire health system kind of almost collapsed under the weight of the hospitalizations that were happening. Okay, and then I don't have a lot more I'm going to, but I do want to get on to the next one. Some of the best work that we see around, particularly around data, is by ProPublica, which is kind of a nonprofit that works in with a lot of issues around government and society and that kind of thing. This one was particularly. Let me get to my window if it's not ProPublica. There's something that I like about this, and I think it's an important thing to kind of pick on and make a point about. Because what they've done here is they took data around unemployment and then broke that data down and job losses based on around the COVID-19 period. And then what they did is they did 2 things. One is they broke it down in where you could actually start to interact with the data here. So you can pick a race and see what the unemployment rate for any period of time was. You could then also break it down either by man or woman, or further break it down by ages and that kind of thing. It's a very simple, it's quite a clever technique. It's a nice way, and it's something that's typical of a ProPublica, where they allow you to explore the data. But the bit that I like the most, that I think is that is important, is that the moment you start to scroll, it starts to actually tell you a story about this, so that you don't necessarily. I mean, I think a lot of the time we see people putting data online and visualizing it, and it's really clever and stuff, but the reader is required to do a lot of work. And if they're not really sure what they're looking for, what they're wanting to derive out of that, sometimes it actually becomes relatively pointless to them. But this layering effect, where you can explore it yourself, or you can kind of bring in an additional story that actually kind of picks out some of the highlights and the points that are important, or that certainly as a journalist we feel is important. I think those are important to bring in. So this is another one I like, this hybrid model of having the data to explore yourself and then split it with the storytelling. And this is where I'm going to go back further, and you may well have seen this, but I'm probably have brought this up in every presentation I've done recently. This is a fantastic story done by Al Jazeera, where they looked at the conflict in South Sudan. The thing about this that impresses me most is, one, it's a great use of storytelling, that they tell the story of individual people involved in the South Sudan conflict and what it means. But in order to reinforce, kind of to give more context to that, they built their own data sets. And what they did with this, in order to build the data sets, is that they used one of the cell phone networks in South Sudan. And I think if I remember correctly, they placed 35,000 calls randomly on that network to people. And when they called them, they had a survey, a questionnaire and a survey in multiple languages, which then people could respond to. And I think the result was something like 2,500 people like actually kind of responded in some or other form to the surveys. And I think a full 405, if I remember correctly, people completed the entire 14 question survey. And then they were able to build out, some data sets. So of the people that replied, people responded that they'd considered themselves displaced, and the regions that they were in. I think this is something that we often we need to think about, is how do we, particularly in the context of where we live in South Africa or Africa, in many cases there isn't massive amounts of data available that we can use, but sometimes we have to be innovative and use kind of the techniques that are available to us or tools that are around in order to kind of build our own data sets. And I think that this is a great example of that. It is a little bit older than a year, so apologies for that, but I do think it's well worth looking at. The other one, before I go into my last couple, and hopefully I got a little bit more time. Al Jazeera is a large organization, but I know that their data team is a very small team and there's only a couple of people in them. What they've done here was a particularly good piece, I think, about the Nile. The issues, if you're aware, if you know anything about it, is that Ethiopia's building a dam. They want a dam at a point, but there are 11 countries that live along the Nile, and this damming the Nile at any point has potential massive knock-on effects for the other countries that rely on the Nile River. And so what Al Jazeera did, had a scientific report, and they worked with an expert in this, where they try to explain the kind of the impact and the scale of the issues. So, and I'm rushing through this a little bit, but you know, just looking at the water required, looking at Egypt, and then this is a very long piece. I'm not even going to get through a third of this, but for example, they looked at, if Ethiopia took 21 years to fill their dam, the impact on Egypt could be XX, and then they broke it down and they used standard techniques. You don't see a huge difference there, but if you go much further down, if they built it in 5 years, the impact from before to after is quite significant. It's a very long piece, and there's a lot more detail to this, but I'd encourage you to look at it. I think it's an excellently done piece. It brings in a lot of the detail, but in a very understandable kind of way. And I think this stands out for me. And I know the people that did this, and they're a very small team, so it's impressive work for that. I've got 3 quick ones to finish off with. One of the operations that I think is doing probably the best work visually in the world at the moment is the South China Morning Post. They do both interactive and non-interactive, or i.e. print publications versions, and I think their graphics are unbelievably good, and the interactive elements are particularly good. So, for example, they've got an entire gallery. You can go to the print arcade. I've linked it there. These are their print publication graphics that they make. You know, we've kind of forgotten the art in doing beautiful print graphics like this that are layered with detail and data. This, for example, the slave trade, just the kind of the level of detail and graphic finesse in this. I mean, this clearly takes a lot of skills and a lot of resources, but it is outstanding work. I think all of their printings are well worth taking the time to look through. So this is for their print publication, but then they do, for example, interactive versions, which are equally good. This is the protest in Hong Kong, if you remember. This is 100 days, and it breaks it down into, these are not so much interactive, but you don't interact, but they do add data and take data as you go. So they explain the kind of conditions. It's very hard to say. These are tear gas fired by days, and then a breakdown of August the 5th and the number of tear gas that was fired on that day. Again, another long piece, well worth looking at, but it kind of breaks down the key days and the key components of these things. It does an excellent job of both kind of bringing in visuals and kind of explaining where things were and how they happened. Another very long piece, well worth it. this was one of the runners up in the Sigma Awards, as was their other piece, which is, I'm not going to go into, but I think it's fascinating, which is, this is a piece about why your smartphone might be causing you text next syndrome, as they call it. There's some questions around that, but as you can see, the visuals are beautiful, and they break it down. They break down the data very nicely. And finally, this is not so much a data story, but I love the presentation on something like this. And I think that this is something that we are starting to see more of. This is by a Dutch publication called Pointer. And what they did is they did an investigation into identity theft after they received an email from somebody they thought it looked suspicious. What they did is so this is the guy who did it. He's a researcher. They got an email from someone, and it's just stylistically, and then they break down, like, how did they actually track down? So there's this thing called open source intelligence, which is kind of using what's available on the internet to try and build, to kind of work out where people are, who they are, what they're doing. And this kind of is kind of closely aligned to data journalism in some senses. But they explain all the steps they went through, including, if you go through, they went through their website and found stock photos of these people. There's an Adobe stock photo, very nicely done, but it's a very illuminating story on exactly the steps they went through and how people actually manipulate things in order to create these false identities and try and kind of either gain some advantage out of people or trick people, whatever the case. So look, I mean, there's probably like 24 more that I could easily go through, but I don't think we have nearly enough time. But I think these, to me, stand out. And the last kind of thing is the kind of the trends at the moment, where we're going. I think a lot of the visual stuff, I think the interactive stuff is great, but it's quite hard to do, and it often is not that well received by users if they don't really understand it. But also using static graphics is also coming back into vogue, which I quite like. We're increasingly use a mixture of static and interactive, but the static ones are coming back and being important. So I mean, I think that there's a long list. So just if you go back to if you look at the presentation, and just for any others, I would suggest that you look through those. There's a rich resource there of other data visualization and data journalism stories that I think you can look at. With that, I think I'll wrap up and give Joe, Raymond, and Adi the chance to talk about the excellent work that they've been doing.
Great, thank you. That was amazing. Cool. So I'm just going to share my screen quick. Ray and I are going to talk about some work we did on the National Lottery. But the underlying message that we want to convey here is not so much the project itself, which I think is pretty cool, but rather how it can actually be quite accessible. So in many cases, we do see some of those visualizations, and I really like what Alistair was saying about static graphics and just simplicity, etc. I think that's crucial. A lot of the time we see the top-end graphics, and many people say, well, we don't have the resources, we don't know how to do it, I don't know how to code, all that sort of thing, and that really puts them off. So this project, Gaming the Lottery, we're taking a slightly, the discussion here is slightly different. It's not so much about visualization, but rather how little technology is needed to have a big impact, and where really traditional journalism still has, is still the most important part of a big project. Whereas in many cases, when people think data journalism, they think technology. In this case, technology was really like 1% of the entire project. Okay, I'm going to start, and Ray's going to continue. And I think also just the flow of the conversation will also show you just some of the flow of how the project worked. So anyway, starting with the hypothesis, with the rampant corruption that engulfed South Africa's government and civil service over the past 2 years.
Do you need to share your screen?
Essentially, the lottery, which rakes in about 7 billion rand a year, there's just so many opportunities to to plunder that big pot. Sorry, I just got a slide here and just reload it. Oh no, it was actually a nice slide. Okay, just imagine a great slide over here, great static data visualization, which basically just says that the best way to win the lottery is to work there. And the reason why is shown in this slide over here, where if you look at, this is published on the Vuleka Mali website. Here's the link, which is essentially looking at government budgets. These are the salaries of employees working at the lottery, 2021. So we have these salary levels 17 to 22. On average, they are earning, that can't be 15 million rand. Am I wrong here? Anyway, it works out that I think that on average, the top 5 are earning 3.5 million rand, which is more than the president does. But overall, there are more people who earn, I think around 45% of employees at the lottery earn over R1 million a year. So rather than buying a ticket, rather apply for a job. It's a much better bet. Cool. So in terms of this data-driven investigation, it is a team sport. It's very seldom that you'll get a single journalist who can both do data and visualizations and do the traditional journalism. And so in this case, the work was really Ray and myself, and just some work from some other people. The process hypothesis, which I've mentioned just now, finding data, extracting it, cleaning it, analyzing it, and then reporting, which is the big part. It isn't a linear process. It goes back and forth. But as you can see, my little hats, hacker hat, press hat, the little black book over here. I think that from a data perspective, just like journalists might have their little black book with contacts, as a data person, you also need to have your little black book of knowing where to find certain data sets. And it's one of those things, you need to be boring and look through the government gazettes and just take a mental note. Oh, right. So Monsanto has applied for, licenses to import X seeds, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just kind of mentally bookmark that. And that's what you really need from a data perspective. Coming together, hypothesis, analysis, that's essentially where where all that magic happens. Cool, so looking at the lottery, this is part of that little black book. Going onto their website, they have a list of all the annual reports in PDF. It's fantastic, you download. This is what it looks like. At the bottom of the annual reports, they have a list of all the grantees. So you can see the first one, Limpopo Mental Health Society, they got 920,000 Rand, etc. And it's like page after page after page after page. And so PDFs are created for presentation, right? So it's so that it looks good, but it's awful if you want to actually analyze the data. So I think there are probably around 50 odd pages, maybe maybe slightly less per annual report for all of these. If you wanted to ask a very simple question like how much money did the lottery give out in a particular year, you can't sit there with a calculator. And so you need to extract that information into a spreadsheet. 1, 2, 3 steps. The first one is convert it to a CSV, a really good open source tool called Tabular. You select your table and you say extract, and a lot of the time it does a pretty good job converting that into a CSV. The problem is data is never clean. So you can see we have Western Cape as the first row, and then sports. We have the amount header, and the spaces in the numbers and commas instead of decimal points, etc. So you need to, unfortunately, spend a lot of time cleaning it up, and that's where Open Refine comes in. I mean, you can do it in very many tools, but this is a really nice one where you load up your CSV. There's an entire process, but you can see that, for instance, in this on the right-hand side, I created a column for province where previously it appeared just at the top. We actually need a province for every row, so you can analyze and say, how much did the lottery give out in the Eastern Cape. Next step, analysis. So this is essentially where the rubber hits the road, and I think this is the essence of what this presentation is about. Is that data is prepared and cleaned and loaded up into using a free tool. I don't like it, but it's really cheap. It's easy to pull something up. Tableau, you can have a look at the link here, but create your own tableaus. And what you can have is this, just a screenshot, obviously, but this is a bar chart with every year all the grants. Every one of these little boxes is a grant. Bigger is obviously more money. And the colors are various categories: arts, culture, charities, miscellaneous, etc. So the great thing about it is you can zoom in, and you start zooming in and you can see that's really interesting. So one of the things that you do often is just looking for the outliers. So you zoom in a bit more, and sorry, I think I do have my slides in the wrong order. Anyway, so the point is, this is in Limpopo, and we can see that one grant received half of all the money for charities in 2016. And it turns out that this is a school. They received around 55 odd million rand. It's a school based in Limpopo, I think around 150 students. And there was absolutely no obvious reason why they would have gotten so much money. So this is just looking at the Department of Education's database of schools. There we go, 168 students. And this is a story that came out of it. So I don't know, Ray, do you want to just give a few words on this?
Yeah, so if I could just go backwards, one of the problems is with the PDFs. You had at that stage 16 years worth of PDF with thousands upon thousands of entries, and the naming protocol was in a mess. So one year they might, for example, give money to Raymond Joseph, another year Joseph Raymond, another year R Joseph, another year Joseph R. And searching through the PDFs, first of all, you would have to guess the name they were using and then use a Control F60. It's just not feasible. What the tool did is it made it keyword searchable, and suddenly something that was very, very, very opaque was very clear, extremely clear, and you could start looking for the outliers. And before I go, the one thing I do want to say is, you know, the tool plays down the path. The tool was fundamental, that was built, but tools do the heavy lifting. You've still got to go on the ground and do the journalism and test what you found and what you see against what the data is saying. Because very often you'll see an outlier, but you don't understand until you get there. Okay, Dee?
Cool. Just tell us about this.
So this story, so part of the story became to understand what was going on, and this takes a lot of reading. So the other thing about this data-driven journalism is you've got to read, you've got to do your research. And one of the things that became clear and has become a major issue in this whole thing is the law was changed in South Africa in 2015, which at the time I believed was used to enable corruption. I now believe, and I've got enough proof, that the law was changed so that the corrupt could get in there and loot the lottery. And so this story began. This is a school, I think it had 168 pupils. It's on the Zimbabwe border in the middle of nowhere. It's registered as both a non-profit and a for-profit company. So again, this is searching through company registrations, etc. And this is what you're seeing in front of you is a farm that was paid for lottery money. The money that was granted to them was for a music festival where money went missing, and then to build wells across the entire South Africa. And the school was used as a conduit. And the lottery is not being very helpful. They are very opaque and they give us little information or nothing at all. And each story, we kept on learning. We kept on seeing trends and we kept on learning, and each story built on the next story. So we were beginning to understand how it was happening. Forward, Eddie.
Ray, we have a question from the audience, or a raised hand, and I can't get the guy to post this question in the chat section. Ira Dukundas, I hope I'm not butchering that name too much. Do you mind unmuting yourself and quickly posing your question? Ira, are you there? Okay, looks like we may have some technical difficulties. Ray, and Adi, you guys can continue, and we will get Ara to post his question when he gets a chance.
Cool.
So
just 1 second, Ray, and I'm going to hand over. So what I went through really quickly just now, a few technical skills, etc. Doesn't take a long time to learn them. It's not, not very difficult. The most important part is what comes next. And here it's over 100 stories and ongoing in terms of number of articles actually publishing corruption, and that all comes from these these initial PDFs that went through that process, went into this tool, and this is where the proper journalism starts. Okay, go for it, Ray.
So it began with finding the outliers and then physically getting onto the ground. So I had one thing to my advantage that many journalists are not going to have. And there was a publication, a ground up online publication that punches above its weight. And an editor, Nathan Gethin, with serious balls, who was prepared to go for it and stick with it, because this investigation has been going on for 3 years. And you've got to keep plodding away. And so one of the things is when people can't attack the facts, and the fact checking that we go through for every story, I think is the best practice example for any publication. When they can't attack the facts, what they do is they attack the messenger. So myself and Ground Up started coming under attack on social media, in the courts. We just carried on, and one of the things that we did, so I don't believe journalists should sue. I don't think it's our place to sue except in exceptional circumstances. We kept our eye on the ball and we ignored the noise. And I can be a bit of a hothead, and I can tell you it was very hard, but it's worked in our favor, because when people throw rocks at you and you don't respond, it's them the fool, not you. If you could just flip through these, Adi.
Yeah, so we just have just a selection of some of the stories. Just stop me, Ray, when you want to point something out.
Just flash through.
Okay.
So each story is leading to the next one, but where they just go back one, Adi, please, and one more. So what the trail is showing us, just go forward, please. I just want you to find one about an old age home or drug rehab. So what we started finding across the country is a series of lottery-funded infrastructure projects, old age homes, museums, libraries, drug rehabilitation, that were in the middle of nowhere, in areas where, so there, the lottery-funded library with empty shelves. In the same town, Kuruman, an unfinished old age home. Most of them are still unfinished because most of the money has been plundered. 6 old age homes, 6 drug rehabs, none of them are yet up and running, and could have done it by phone, but you really needed to go there and to see what was going on. And when lockdown came, suddenly you were unable to travel. But what I was able to do is my modus operandi then to look for NPOs on the ground and talk to them until I found someone who I believed I could trust. And I used them when I couldn't get there. They would go in with cameras and take video and take pictures. It wasn't ideal, but nevertheless, we still had eyes on the ground. And I think that's an important lesson learned there. When you can't get yourself to a place, find someone you trust, but always make sure. So one of the things that we have done throughout, and it's just normal journalism, is unless we've not used single sources, unless it's a document that we've verified. But other than that, we've not published any stories where there are not at least a minimum of 2 totally independent sources, which I think is just good journalism anyway. I mean, we discovered that one of the guys used money to buy a luxury home on an estate in Pretoria. Porsches were built, homes were homes. It's so the South Africans will understand what's going on here. This is nothing new. And then we started discovering that the COO of the lottery was at the heart of this. He is currently on suspension. There's a series of investigations going on. I actually wrote a story the other day, by the way. He's been off work since March. He's been paid in that time almost 2 million rand to stay at home. And as we dug, we discovered that companies in which his wife was involved got money. The story about lottery supporters, so out of the woodwork suddenly popped all these sock puppets who suddenly came to the defense of the lottery. The mistake that they made there is they shone a light on them, and I went to go and have a look who they were, and it turns out that they were lottery beneficiary. It opened up a whole nother can of worms. You can go through to the end, Eddie. So the impact, the government has launched investigation into the lottery. What is not there, because I only did the story yesterday, is the Serious Crimes Unit, the Hawks in South Africa, have set up a special unit to investigate the lottery. And there's been a lot of criminal complaints laid with police that have disappeared. They are busy at the moment coordinating all those criminal complaints under one unit. Several law enforcement agents are looking at it. Significantly, the lottery in 2019, for the first time ever, refused to publish their list of beneficiaries. It's a direct result of our reporting, by the way. And eventually Parliament forced them. Parliament has been very interesting during lockdown, very effective. I've certainly seen the committee that's got oversight. But Media Monitoring Africa and the South African National Editors Forum have now gone ahead. They've gone to court to have a part of the Lotteries Act declared unconstitutional. It's definitely ultra vires. It goes against the Constitution, and it's being used to hide corruption. Complaints have been lodged with the Lottery Accountancy Watchdog Body to have the COO struck off, and criminal complaints, fraud and racketeering lodged against NLC board members. So from very small beginnings, and every day there's more happening. Do you want to take over there, Dee?
Sure. So just a few kind of backstory stories. If you go to the NLC's webpage now and try to find those annual reports I showed right at the beginning of the presentation, that's what you're going to get, 404. But if you've ever heard of the Wayback Machine, the internet never forgets, and that's where you can get all of the annual reports. And so that's the other thing. No one can really, change. If it was online before, it's almost certainly still going to be online now. And so trying to cover your tracks is not going to work.
Wayback Machine, guys, just by the way, just go backwards. Wayback Machine is a very, very powerful tool. It's free. You use online, just Google Wayback Machine tutorial, Wayback Machine tutorial, and what you're going to find is how to use it. You can also archive stories. So I often, when I link to a story, I'll archive it on the Wayback Machine, that even if it's removed off the internet, my archive version will always be linked. Carry on, Eddie.
Adi and Ray, we've got a question from the audience. Question from Eva Constantaras. Are there any small, scrappy data teams or journalists in Africa you recommend following? I'm thinking along the lines of NEWSPLEX, which you mentioned, or Data Fight in Nigeria.
So look, I certainly know the South African ones. And one of the commonalities we all have. So with GroundUp, one of the pleasures of GroundUp is GroundUp doesn't take advertising. So there's no advertising pressure on them. You've got Amabungani, which is really actually a very small team. You've got Scorpio, which is a pretty small team. I'm trying to think which of the other ones. They're Becca Sissi, the health guys. And increasingly across Africa, that's what's happening. But what I want to say to the journalists in the audience, and I think this is really, really, really important, is Adi has already said it. Data journalism is a team game. Find yourself a data sus buddy. So I'm blessed to have found Adi, who's a step up. But don't try and do it all on your own. You know, it's very rare when it comes together under one person. It's very much a team job. But there are investigative journalism units across Africa. There's Botswana, there's Tanzania, they are there, but not necessarily. So through the CCIJ, the Center for Cooperative Investigative Journalism, which actually grew out of this lottery investigation, by the way, this is what we are doing, is we are working with journalists, we're including data, we are including data elements to the story, we're helping them with the data, we're going to give basic data training. So even in answer to your question, not a lot happening across Africa, and this is where CCIJ has stepped into it to try and introduce data into investigative journalism, but with support, because most of the time when you talk to journalists about data, they straight away think it's the stuff they put in their mobile. A lot of them think to put in their mobile phone to access the internet. The tools we used, there's a list of the tools. I know that this is in the chat. I think this will go into the chat. And then Adi, if you could just go forward. So again, data-driven journalism is a team sport. Like when you go and interview a human being, data is no different as a source. You interrogate, you interview your data, you ask it questions, you double check it. Journalism goes beyond he says, she says. And it's important to give your data a human face, or as I, as a news editor, would say, if a story is worth doing, it's worth going there to get the story. In many cases, what we saw as outliers turned into the most amazing stories that we would never have got, and the context, because what we also looked at is how the corruption is affecting ordinary people. And that can only be done by going on the ground. Go forward, Adi. So the lottery tool is built. Adi will talk very briefly on this, but Adi will talk about the new tool, but the tool was built on a free tool, and it's become a bit unwieldy with all the data, and it's slowed down. So we're going to rebuild it. And we've got a bit of funding to do it, and I'm planning to do a webinar or two on how to investigate the lottery. So lottery was not on my radar. I mean, I was last an active journalist. I'm more in recent years, more trained an editor, a news editor. I became a lottery journalist by default. It became a beat. I saw something that I couldn't let go. And any country, anyone who's listening to this, who's in any country where there's a lottery, there's got to be someone in your newsroom, or if you're freelance, make it your beat. There are rich stories to tell. We tried to look for good news stories. We struggled. But ideally, there should be a mix of good and bad news stories. And then if you want to be alerted when the new tool is ready and receive details of the webinar, if you just drop me an email, there's my email, rayjoe@iafrica.com. And please use Lottery Tool Alert as a subject matter. And as soon as the new tool is built, and when we do the webinars, I will contact everyone and invite you to come along. So although this is South African, I think there's a lesson in there for all journalists, for all these kind of investigations. And these are the people who have assisted us. And I just want to give a quick shout out. There's a thing there, the Limpopo Mirror. That is a colleague of mine, Anton van Zyl, who's a really good investigative journalist, who owns two newspapers, the Zoutpansberger and the Limpopo Mirror up in Louis Trichardt in the far north of South Africa. He has been a key partner with me in this investigation. And again, when it becomes a team game, Anton has this gift of being able to read financial reports and pick up stuff. And every one of us who were in the team, we've all each got our own strengths. And together it makes a powerful team. Thanks, Adi.
Cool. I mean, I think maybe just some parting words. We talk about supported by and partners, etc. This project was very much on a shoestring budget. This wasn't a massive kind of massively funded investigation. I mean, we do have the Indigo Trust, funded a project on corporate data a few years back, and they didn't even know that, their funding essentially seeded, some of this work. So again, maybe just to reiterate one last time, is that you don't have to be a big team, you don't have to necessarily be flashy, and you don't have to, necessarily be technically minded in order to, hopefully we're convinced to work on a project which has actually had some significant impact. Cool, that is our presentation.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you, Raymond, for that great presentation. It looks like we're coming close to time, and unless we've got about a minute, so if you have a pressing question, and I'm putting this to the floor, please post it. But as we wait for any last minute questions, I'm just going to ask for a closing thought from Alistair, since Adi, you got a closing thought. So Alistair, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us in this last minute before we wrap things up and let people have the rest of the afternoon?
Thanks, Sio. Not particularly closing thought. I mean, I think the work that Raymond and Adi have done has been excellent. I don't think that we see enough of that. Enough of journalists really working with the data locally to kind of build stories. But we are starting to see that emerge as a field of expertise, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see this happening. We knew it's not just about flashy graphics; it's also about the hard work of analyzing the data and finding the stories in it and reporting on it properly. But thank you for the time.
Thank you, Alistair. We have a last-minute question from Mukhali Molloy. She was directing it to Ray, saying that it's great to hear you speaking about this investigation and how this work comes together. I'm also aware that some people at the lottery have taken you and ground up to court over the publication of this investigation. Can you talk about what this is like and how you keep this work going under those conditions? I think you have answered it in part, but maybe I'll give you like a few seconds to just condense that answer, Ray.
So look, when you are under sustained attack, it's very hard not to react. And my advice to everyone, and Alida Dasnoy and Nathan Geffen, I must give them credit for just keeping me in check, because I was the one who was actually getting it. We were sued. Look, the decision became, we keep an eye on the prize, we are doing a story, and we are not going to get distracted. We have been sued. It's taken up a lot of money. It's taken up a lot of resources. But I guess that's part of the process. It's just in conclusion, I just want to say that without an editor and a publication, it's all very well doing this work. What I early on was going to different publications who ran a story, and when you went back with another story, what they would say, oh no, we've done lottery. And the answer is, well, you've done a story about lottery. It continues. Without the kind of sustained pressure, we would never have achieved what we did. So it's just that whole combination comes together. And people sue when they're scared. People sue, they launch lawfare to try and shut us up. It had the opposite effect.
Great stuff. Thank you, Adi. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Ray. So as we're closing off, just be aware of tomorrow's sessions. We have a workshop the Africa-China Journalism Forum. That's at 10 in the morning, and a few others, I'm sure. And thank you, everyone, for your time. Have a great afternoon. Also tomorrow, just wanted to raise that we have a panel discussion on investigative podcasting, and at 3:30 we have a training on emerging tools and techniques as well. So lots to look forward to tomorrow. We'll see you then. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Ciao.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.